Picture this, you're a cavalryman in 1854. The sun is rising over a battlefield in Crimea. In front of you stretches a long valley, and at the end of that valley, you see rows of Russian cannons waiting. On the hillsides to your left and right, more artillery is already aimed directly at you. And yet, an order has just come down. You are to charge. Not retreat. Not hesitate. Charge. You glance at the men beside you, 600 riders, their horses restless, their faces pale but determined. Everyone knows this mission makes no sense. Everyone knows it could mean certain death. And still, the trumpets sound. The brigade lowers its sabers, leans forward in the saddle, and begins the ride into what one poet would later call the Valley of Death. This wasn't just a military mistake. It became one of the most famous, and infamous, charges in history. Today, we're diving into the story of the Light Brigade, the suicidal charge that forged a legend. Setting the scene, the Crimean War and Balaclava. The charge of the Light Brigade did not happen in isolation. It was part of a much larger conflict known as the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856. This war began when the Russian Empire attempted to expand its power into Ottoman territory and gain greater influence over the Black Sea. Britain and France, fearing that Russian expansion would threaten their own trade routes and balance of power, decided to support the Ottoman Empire and resist Russian ambitions. The focus of the war soon became the Russian naval base at Sevastopol, a fortress city on the Crimean Peninsula. Capturing Sevastopol would cripple Russian naval power in the region. British and French armies landed in Crimea in 1854 and began their advance toward the city. As they laid siege to Sevastopol, the Allies needed a secure supply route. This route ran through the port of Balaclava, which became a vital lifeline for British forces. The Russians, recognizing its importance, launched an attack on Balaclava on October 25, 1854. The Battle of Balaclava was not a single, neat fight but a series of confusing clashes. First came the Russian attack on Turkish forces holding redoubts, small defensive positions. Then the famous thin red line of Scottish infantry held firm against the Russian cavalry charge. Shortly afterward, the heavy brigade of British cavalry successfully counterattacked and drove back Russian horsemen. But in the middle of all this chaos, orders began flying back and forth between commanders. Misunderstandings grew, tension rose, and soon one unclear instruction would set the stage for one of the most tragic and legendary moments in military history: the charge of the Light Brigade. Who's who, the main characters. To understand how the charge of the Light Brigade happened, we need to meet the key figures involved. These men were all high-ranking officers in the British Army, and their decisions, or their failures, shaped the disaster that followed. Lord Raglan. Lord Raglan was the overall commander of the British forces in Crimea. A veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, he had once served under the Duke of Wellington. Raglan was brave and experienced, but he had lost an arm years earlier and often relied heavily on his staff to communicate his orders. He was positioned on high ground during the Battle of Balaclava, which gave him a clear view of enemy movements, but also meant that the officers on the battlefield could not see what he saw. This gap in perspective would prove critical. Lord Lucan. Lord George Lucan commanded the British Cavalry Division, which included both the Heavy Brigade and the Light Brigade. He was a strict and proud officer, but he had a tense relationship with both Raglan and his own brother-in-law, Lord Cardigan. Lucan was criticized for being overly cautious at times, but in this case, he would be blamed for obeying an unclear order too literally. Lord Cardigan. Lord James Brudenell, better known as Lord Cardigan, led the Light Brigade itself. Known for his wealth and aristocratic lifestyle, Cardigan had little popularity among his men. He was stubborn, rigid in following orders, and often more concerned with discipline and appearances than with the well-being of his soldiers. Still, he was brave and led the Light Brigade from the front when the fatal charge began. Captain Lewis Nolan. Captain Nolan was the cavalry officer who carried the fatal written order from Lord Raglan to Lord Lucan. A skilled horseman and one of the more daring officers in the army, Nolan was frustrated by what he saw as indecisiveness in the British command. When he delivered Raglan's order, he added his own hand gestures and comments, which only added to the confusion. Tragically, Nolan was one of the very first men killed during the charge, so he never had the chance to explain exactly what he meant. Together, these four men, Raglan, Lucan, Cardigan, and Nolan, created a perfect storm of miscommunication, pride, and misunderstanding. The decisions they made, and the grudges they carried, set the Light Brigade on its path toward destruction. The confused order. The heart of the tragedy lay in a single unclear order. On the morning of October 25, 1854, Lord Raglan saw Russian troops moving captured British guns from the Causeway Heights. From his elevated position, he wanted to stop them before they could carry the weapons away. He quickly wrote an instruction and sent it by messenger to Lord Lucan. The written order read: Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Troop horse artillery may accompany. French cavalry is on your left. Our area. At first glance, this seemed simple: attack the enemy and recover the guns. But the problem was which guns? Raglan, looking from high ground, meant the artillery on the heights. Lucan, down in the valley, could not see those guns from his position. From where he stood, the only obvious enemy guns were at the far end of the valley, directly defended by Russian artillery and infantry on three sides. The confusion grew worse when Captain Nolan delivered the order. Instead of carefully explaining Raglan's true intention, Nolan reportedly gestured impatiently down the valley, reinforcing Lucan's mistaken belief. Some witnesses said Nolan's tone was sharp, as if he was criticizing Lucan for hesitation. Lucan, unsure but unwilling to challenge a direct order, passed the command to Lord Cardigan, who led the Light Brigade. Cardigan also doubted the wisdom of the attack but followed orders to the letter. Neither man wanted to disobey Raglan, especially during a critical moment of battle. What should have been a limited strike on retreating Russian troops turned into a full frontal charge against a heavily fortified artillery position. This one miscommunication would send over 600 cavalrymen riding into almost certain death, and into the pages of history. The ride begins the charge. When the order was given, the Light Brigade formed up at the mouth of the valley. The brigade consisted of about 670 cavalrymen from 5 regiments, the 4th and 13th Light Dragoons, the 17th Lancers, and the 8th and 11th Hussars. These were lightly armed, fast-moving horsemen, excellent for quick strikes and chasing down retreating enemies, but poorly equipped for a direct assault on entrenched artillery. As the trumpet sounded, the men lowered their sabers and lances. They knew the task ahead seemed hopeless, but discipline and duty drove them forward. At the very front rode Lord Cardigan, leading with characteristic rigidity. Behind him, rows of cavalry thundered down the valley, horses kicking up clouds of dust. Almost immediately, the Russians opened fire. Cannons on both sides of the valley rained down shot and shell, tearing through the charging ranks. Eyewitnesses described the ground exploding beneath the horses' hooves and men falling in heaps. Yet the survivors pressed forward, determined not to falter. Captain Louis Nolan, the officer who had delivered the order, was killed early in the charge when a shell fragment struck him. His death removed the only man who might have clarified the misunderstanding in time. Despite the deadly barrage, the Light Brigade reached the Russian battery at the end of the valley. In a furious clash, they slashed into the gunners, scattering some and briefly overrunning the artillery position. But they had no reinforcements, and no way to hold the ground. Within minutes, they were forced to retreat, facing the same wall of fire on their way back that had devastated them on the way in. Immediate aftermath on the field. As the battered remnants of the Light Brigade rode back, the battlefield fell into a stunned silence. What had just happened seemed almost impossible. A proud cavalry unit, one of the finest in the British Army, had been cut to pieces in less than half an hour. The casualties. The cost was staggering. Of the about 670 men who charged, more than 110 were killed outright. Another 160 were wounded, many severely, and around 40 were taken prisoner by Russian forces. Out of nearly 700 horses, almost 400 were lost, leaving the brigade without the mounts that gave it its speed and power. The once formidable force was reduced to fewer than half its strength in a single action. The survivors' shock. The men who survived described a mixture of disbelief and pride. Some were furious that they had been sent into such an impossible situation, while others clung to the idea that they had done their duty with honor. One officer later recalled that, "It was magnificent, but it was not war," capturing the sense of both awe and horror felt by observers. Witness reactions. From the hillsides, British and French soldiers who had watched the charge unfold were shaken. They had seen their comrades ride straight into what looked like a wall of fire, and then return in broken, scattered groups. Some wept openly at the sight. Even Russian officers were astonished. They reportedly praised the Light Brigade's courage, calling it one of the bravest but most reckless acts they had ever witnessed. Commanders in conflict. Back at headquarters, the arguments began almost immediately. Lord Raglan insisted his order had been perfectly clear. Lord Lucan claimed the instructions were vague and impossible to interpret correctly. Lord Cardigan defended himself by saying he had only followed the commands given to him. With Captain Nolan dead early in the charge, the one man who might have explained the intention behind Raglan's order was gone, leaving the mystery unresolved. The battlefield scene. Reports described the valley floor after the charge as a ghastly sight, littered with shattered guns, broken swords, fallen horses, and men who had fought to the last breath. Survivors limped back with torn uniforms, bloodied faces, and broken weapons. For many soldiers watching from a distance, it was an image of both tragedy and heroism they would never forget. The reputation gained. Militarily, the charge achieved nothing. The Russians still held their guns, and the Light Brigade was crippled. Yet the sheer audacity of the attack impressed both enemies and allies. To many, the bravery of the men, obeying orders in the face of certain death, overshadowed the blunder that had sent them there. The immediate aftermath, then, was a mix of grief, anger, admiration, and confusion, emotions that would only grow stronger once news of the charge reached Britain. The big question: who was to blame? The charge of the Light Brigade quickly became one of the most debated military disasters in history. Almost as soon as the survivors returned, arguments erupted over who was responsible for the catastrophe. The truth was tangled in pride, rivalry, and confusion. Lord Raglan's role. As the commander-in-chief, Lord Raglan issued the order that began it all. From his position on the heights, he could clearly see Russian troops removing captured guns. To him, it seemed obvious that his cavalry should stop them. But Raglan failed to realize that from the valley floor, Lucan and Cardigan could not see those guns at all. His written order lacked specific detail about which guns to attack, creating the confusion. Many critics later said Raglan should have worded his instructions far more carefully. Lord Lucan's role. Lord Lucan, commanding the cavalry division, received Raglan's order from Captain Nolan. Lucan argued afterward that the instructions were vague and impossible to interpret with certainty. However, instead of questioning or clarifying the order, he passed it directly to Cardigan. His defenders claimed he was simply obeying the chain of command. His critics accused him of lacking initiative and judgment. Lord Cardigan's role. Lord Cardigan, leader of the Light Brigade, also had doubts. He knew charging directly into a heavily defended artillery line was suicidal. Yet, he obeyed Lucan's command without question. Some argue that Cardigan was rigid, preferring to follow orders exactly rather than risk being accused of insubordination. Others say he should have refused an order that was clearly disastrous. Cardigan later insisted he bore no blame. He had done only what he was told. Captain Nolan's role. Captain Lewis Nolan, the messenger, played a mysterious part. He reportedly gestured impatiently down the valley as he delivered Raglan's order, reinforcing Lucan's mistaken belief. Some think Nolan, frustrated with the hesitation of cavalry leaders, deliberately urged them to act boldly, even recklessly. Because Nolan was killed in the opening minutes of the charge, his true intentions could never be explained. This left his role a matter of speculation. Shared responsibility. Historians often conclude that blame cannot be placed on just one man. Instead, it was the result of a chain of miscommunication and poor relationships. Raglan's unclear wording. Nolan's hurried delivery, Lucan's failure to seek clarification, Cardigan's blind obedience. All of this was worsened by the personal animosity between Lucan and Cardigan, who disliked and distrusted each other. In the end, pride, poor communication, and rigid discipline combined to create tragedy. The larger lesson, the blame game, continued long after the battle, with each officer defending his reputation. But the larger truth was clear. The charge of the Light Brigade showed how dangerous miscommunication can be in war. One poorly worded order, misunderstood and unchallenged, had destroyed a whole brigade in less than 20 minutes. From disaster to legend. What could have remained simply a military blunder quickly transformed into something far greater, a legend. News of the charge reached Britain within weeks, carried by war correspondents who had witnessed the event. One of the most famous accounts came from William Howard Russell, a journalist for the Times, who vividly described the bravery and tragedy of the Light Brigade. His words captured the imagination of the British public, turning a failed mission into a story of almost mythic heroism. The story spread even further when the poet Alfred, Lord Tennyson, wrote the charge of the Light Brigade only weeks after the battle. His verses immortalized the cavalrymen as men who knew the order was mistaken but rode forward anyway, their loyalty and courage unquestionable. Lines like, "There's not to reason why, there's but to do and die," became forever linked with the event, ensuring that generations would remember it not just as a disaster, but as an example of duty and sacrifice. Back home, the public admired the men who had ridden into the Valley of Death. Though some questioned the competence of their leaders, the soldiers themselves were praised as national heroes. The charge became a symbol of the British fighting spirit, the idea that even in the face of overwhelming odds, British soldiers would not falter. Even abroad, the Light Brigade's charge gained respect. The Russians, despite being the enemy, spoke with honor about the courage of their opponents. French allies compared it to some of the greatest acts of valor in military history. Over time, paintings, songs, and stories retold the charge again and again, cementing its place in history. What began as a mistake on the battlefield was reshaped into a powerful legend of loyalty, courage, and sacrifice. A reminder that sometimes, history remembers not the outcome, but the bravery displayed along the way. The lasting legacy of the charge. The charge of the Light Brigade did not win a battle, and it certainly did not change the outcome of the Crimean War. Yet its legacy has lasted far longer than the war itself. It became more than a military event, it turned into a lesson, a symbol, and a story that continues to inspire and warn future generations. For the British Army, the charge became a painful reminder of the importance of clear communication and leadership in battle. Military historians and commanders have studied it for more than 150 years as a textbook example of how confusion and poor coordination can lead to disaster, even among highly trained soldiers. It reinforced the idea that bravery alone is not enough to win wars. Leadership, planning, and clarity are just as crucial. But beyond the military lessons, the Light Brigade lived on in culture. Tennyson's poem ensured that schoolchildren across Britain memorized the verses for generations. Artists painted dramatic scenes of the charge, and composers even wrote music inspired by it. In the 20th century, films and documentaries revived the story, presenting it to new audiences. The charge became part of Britain's national identity, celebrated as an example of duty and courage in the face of hopeless odds. For the soldiers themselves, those who survived carried scars for life. Many returned home maimed or broken, yet their names were remembered with honor. Memorials were built, reunions were held, and decades later, the few surviving veterans were still recognized as living links to that legendary day in 1854. Even today, the phrase, "Charge of the Light Brigade," is used around the world as shorthand for a brave but doomed effort, an action taken with courage, but without a chance of success. It shows how a single moment, even one born from error, can echo through history and shape how we think about heroism. In the end, the Light Brigade may not have achieved its military objective, but it achieved something else: immortality. It forged a legend that continues to remind us of the thin line between glory and tragedy, and how courage can sometimes outlive victory itself. Courage that outlived victory. The charge of the Light Brigade stands as one of the most extraordinary stories in military history. On that October day in 1854, a mix of miscommunication, rigid obedience, and impossible bravery created a moment that was both tragic and unforgettable. Hundreds of men rode into a valley where survival was nearly impossible, and yet, their courage turned disaster into legend. The charge teaches us two lessons at once. On one hand, it warns of the cost of poor leadership and unclear orders, a mistake that can destroy lives in seconds. On the other, it reminds us of the unshakable spirit of ordinary soldiers, who, even when they knew the odds, refused to turn back. That is why we still remember the Light Brigade today. Not because they won, but because they showed that courage, loyalty, and sacrifice can shine even in the darkest moments. Their ride into the Valley of Death may have been doomed, but it left behind a legacy that history will never forget.